Imagine waking up in a medieval castle or a peasant's cottage in the year 1300. The morning chill bites at your skin, the smell of burning wood fills the air, and you shuffle off to relieve yourself. But here's the question: when you're finished, what do you use to clean up, before toilet paper was even invented? The answer is not only surprising but also a little disgusting, and it reveals a lot about how people lived, how society was divided, and how different cultures solved one of the most basic human problems. So today, let's travel back through the muddy streets, stone castles, and outhouses of medieval Europe to uncover what people really used instead of toilet paper, and why some of those methods are still around today. Hygiene in the Middle Ages, setting the stage. When we think of medieval Europe, we often picture mud-covered streets, poor hygiene, and people rarely bathing. While there's some truth to this, the story is more complicated. Hygiene mattered in the Middle Ages, though it looked very different from what we're used to. Toilets were not always private. Castles often had garderobes, stone seats that dropped waste directly down into a pit or moat. Peasants, on the other hand, might use a simple hole dug in the ground or a wooden outhouse shared by multiple families. But regardless of social class, everyone faced the same issue: what to use to clean themselves afterward. Modern toilet paper wasn't invented until China's Tang dynasty, around the 6th century, and it didn't make its way to Europe until centuries later. So people had to improvise. The peasant's choice: straw, hay, and grass. For the majority of medieval Europeans, farmers and peasants, the simplest materials were the most common. Straw and hay were plentiful after harvests and were often kept near outhouses or latrines for wiping. Grass, leaves, or even handfuls of moss could also serve the purpose. This may not sound luxurious, but it was practical. Straw was cheap, absorbent, and easy to burn afterward, which also helped with sanitation. In forested regions, moss was a particularly soft and effective alternative, and some historians believe it was even preferred for comfort compared to straw. Imagine a cold English morning in 1200, a farmer finishing his business in a wooden shack, reaching for a bundle of dry straw tied together and left in the corner. For him, this was as normal as a roll of toilet paper is for us today. Nobility and the wealthy: wool, linen, and water. While peasants made do with straw and leaves, the wealthier classes had access to more refined options. Nobles and royalty could afford wool or scraps of linen cloth, which were softer and more comfortable. These materials were often reused, washed and cleaned afterward, making them an early form of reusable toilet cloth. In some cases, water was used for cleansing, especially in households with access to running water or basins. For example, medieval castles sometimes had piss pots and basins nearby for washing. In Islamic Spain, bidet-like washing practices were far more common, influenced by religious emphasis on cleanliness. This difference in hygiene shows just how divided medieval society was. The poor wiped with what grew in their fields, the rich wiped with fabric woven by skilled craftsmen. Seashells, stones, and other hard options. Not all medieval wiping methods were soft. In coastal regions, seashells were sometimes used, though the comfort level must have been questionable at best. Smooth pebbles or flat stones were another option, particularly in areas where vegetation was scarce. Roman texts describe the use of sponges tied to sticks, called tersorium, dipped in vinegar or salt water. While that was more common in the ancient world, some medieval Europeans may have carried on the tradition, especially in monasteries or regions with strong Roman influence. Religious influence and ritual cleanliness. Religion also shaped hygiene practices. In medieval monasteries, monks followed strict routines, including cleanliness after using the latrine. Some monastic rules mention the use of water for cleansing, while others describe cloth rags that were washed and reused. In Islamic regions of medieval Europe, particularly in Al-Andalus, modern Spain, water was the standard method of cleansing after using the toilet. This practice continues in many cultures today and is often considered more hygienic than dry wiping. This shows us that what people used wasn't just about availability, it was also about culture, religion, and daily habit. Leaves and natural materials. Leaves were one of the simplest and most widespread solutions. Large, soft leaves like mullein or plantain were often chosen for their smooth texture. Families living near forests would collect specific types of leaves for this very purpose. Moss was another favorite, especially in damp, northern climates. It was soft, absorbent, and easy to find. In some places, bundles of moss were even kept inside homes for convenience. These natural materials weren't perfect, but they worked, and for many medieval families, they were the most reliable option year-round. Sanitation and waste disposal. What medieval people used to wipe is only part of the story. Sanitation also depended on where waste went afterward. In cities, chamber pots were emptied into cesspits or, unfortunately, sometimes dumped directly into the streets. Outhouses often had pits lined with straw to absorb liquid waste. Garderobes in castles dropped waste down into ditches, sometimes leading into water sources, creating a nightmare for disease control. Interestingly, in Scandinavia and parts of northern Europe, people sometimes used ashes or sand after wiping, both to clean and to cover up waste. This practice also helped reduce smells and the spread of bacteria. Cultural perceptions of cleanliness. One fascinating detail about medieval hygiene is that people didn't always see wiping as necessary in the same way we do today. For many, wiping thoroughly wasn't expected, it was enough to remove the worst of it and move on with the day's work. Some medical texts from the Middle Ages even discuss digestion and bowel movements in detail, reflecting the belief that waste disposal was linked to health and balance in the body. Physicians might recommend certain foods to ensure clean bowel movements that required less wiping. This shows us that wiping wasn't just a practical act, it was also tied to broader ideas of health, medicine, and what was considered normal in society. By now, we've uncovered some of the main methods medieval people used instead of toilet paper, from straw and moss for peasants, to wool and linen for nobles, to seashells and stones in harsher environments. Regional differences across medieval Europe. While peasants in England might have relied on straw or moss, practices varied widely across Europe depending on geography, culture, and available resources. In Northern Europe, in Scandinavia, moss, wool, and even snow were common. Snow was surprisingly effective, it was abundant, clean, and left people feeling refreshed, though certainly cold. Southern Europe, in Mediterranean regions, water was far more common. Aqueducts and advanced plumbing, inherited from Roman engineering, made washing after defecation more accessible, especially in urban centers. In Eastern Europe, in Slavic regions, rags, straw, and leaves were typical, while ashes or sand were sometimes used afterward to absorb odors. Religion also played a role. In Christian Europe, wiping was primarily a practical matter. In Islamic Spain, however, ritual cleanliness made water the gold standard, with rules about purification influencing everyday habits. Hygiene, disease, and the Black Death. The 14th century brought the devastating Black Death, which killed nearly a third of Europe's population. While the plague was spread primarily by fleas and rats, poor sanitation, including waste disposal and wiping methods, contributed to its rapid spread. Many cesspits overflowed into rivers, contaminating water supplies. People sometimes used the same cloths or rags repeatedly, washing them infrequently. Combined with close living quarters in growing cities, this created perfect conditions for disease. Interestingly, some regions that relied on water for cleansing, such as Islamic Spain or parts of the Middle East, fared slightly better in terms of hygiene. This shows us how simple practices like washing with water could make a big difference in public health, even in the medieval world. Medical texts and hygiene advice. Medieval medical texts often included advice on bowel movements and hygiene. Physicians believed digestion and waste removal were central to maintaining the body's balance of humors. Some manuals recommended wiping thoroughly, not for cleanliness as we understand it today, but to prevent illness caused by corruption or lingering waste. Others suggested dietary changes to produce cleaner bowel movements that required less wiping. These texts reveal how health, medicine, and sanitation were deeply connected in medieval thought. What we see as a purely practical act, wiping, was for them tied to broader theories of health and disease. Reusable cloths and early toilet paper. In wealthier households, especially monasteries and noble estates, reusable cloths were common. These cloths, made of linen or wool, were washed and reused, functioning much like modern reusable diapers. In some monasteries, rules were written about how many cloths could be used per person, and strict systems were in place for washing them. This shows that even in a time of limited resources, there was an effort to maintain standards of hygiene. China, meanwhile, had already developed something closer to modern toilet paper by the 6th century. By the 14th century, records mention the production of thousands of sheets of paper for the emperor's use. Europe, however, wouldn't adopt this invention for centuries. Water as the cleanest option. While many medieval Europeans relied on straw, moss, or cloth, water remained the cleanest and most effective option. In Islamic regions, washing with water after relieving oneself was not only cultural but religious. This tradition spread into Spain and Sicily during the Middle Ages, influencing local practices. In cities with access to aqueducts or wells, water was sometimes used for cleansing, though this was less common in rural areas. Nobles in castles often had servants bring basins of water for washing after using the garderobe. In some parts of the world, particularly India and the Middle East, water has always been the standard method of cleansing, and it remains so today. Humor and social attitudes toward wiping. To medieval people, wiping wasn't just practical, it was also a subject of humor. Satirical poems and folk tales sometimes made fun of poor hygiene or strange wiping practices. For example, medieval jesters might joke about nobles who wasted fine linen for such an undignified purpose, or peasants who used thorny leaves by mistake. These jokes remind us that while wiping is a serious matter of hygiene, it was also a shared human experience, something everyone had to do, and something everyone could laugh about. Transition toward modern toilet paper. By the late medieval period, paper began to spread more widely in Europe, thanks to trade with China and the rise of papermaking in places like Italy. But paper was far too expensive to be used as toilet paper. It was reserved for writing, religious texts, and official documents. Instead, people continued using straw, moss, rags, and water well into the Renaissance. It wasn't until the 19th century that commercially produced toilet paper became common in Europe and North America. A global perspective, beyond Europe. To put things in perspective, it's important to note that medieval Europe wasn't the only region with creative solutions to wiping. China, paper was used for personal hygiene as early as the Tang dynasty. By the Ming dynasty, records describe 720,000 sheets produced annually for the imperial court. Japan, thin wooden sticks, called chugi, were used for cleaning, often with water. The Middle East and India, water was, and still is, the primary method, often with the left hand. Indigenous peoples in the Americas, materials like corn cobs, snow, and leaves were used. This global view shows how different societies approached the same problem in unique ways, shaped by environment, resources, and culture. Why toilet paper took so long to arrive? Why did it take until the 19th century for toilet paper to become common in Europe and America? The answer is simple: people already had plenty of effective, cheap alternatives. Straw, rags, moss, and water did the job well enough. It wasn't until urbanization, industrialization, and indoor plumbing changed daily life that toilet paper became a necessity. The rise of flush toilets, in particular, required something soft, disposable, and pipe-friendly, leading to the invention of the modern toilet roll. So, what did medieval people use instead of toilet paper? The answer is, almost anything they could get their hands on: straw, moss, wool, rags, seashells, stones, water, and more. This simple act of daily life reveals a surprising amount about medieval society, its class divisions, its hygiene practices, its cultural values, and even its sense of humor. And while some methods may seem strange or uncomfortable to us, many of them, like washing with water, are still considered superior to toilet paper today. Next time you reach for a roll of paper, remember, it's a luxury of modern history. For most of human existence, wiping looked very different, and a lot more creative.